Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the third season of the Rallye DNA podcast. Me, Killian, and myself are delighted to welcome you back for what we hope is going to be the best series to date.
Yeah, welcome back, guys, and thanks for the support so far. We're excited to be back again doing this after a bit of a break, which was nice. And Jamie, I believe, has some big news for us as well.
We do. We are very fortunate to now have a sponsor, Slip and Grip Automotive. They are a UK-based motorsport events organizer and members club with access to the Bont Rally stage in mid-Wales. It's a completely unique venue that's very, very representative of most of the awful snatches of complex hot map tarmac that we have in the UK, Ireland, and further afield. And thus, it's the ideal test, shakedown, and development venue for any clubman and upwards rally team, driver, or otherwise. And we're delighted to have Ross and the rest of the guys on board with us, and I've no doubt that their support will help us make the podcast even better.
Absolutely, and it certainly looks like a great facility. You only have to take one look at their social media to see the sort of roster of vehicles and crews that have been there, including, I suppose, notably to mention last year's British Rally champions, Oisin Price and Nola Sullivan, testing in the Melvin Evans Motorsport Polo up there. So, if you test at Slip and Grip's facility, maybe you can be a British Rally champion too.
So stay tuned, and we hope to be able to announce some competitions and that kind of thing in conjunction with the guys at Slip and Grip later in the year.
Great stuff. Really looking forward to it, and hopefully start of a good partnership, and we can deliver a good season in association with them. So let's cut down to business. Tobacco sponsorship not allowed anymore, so we've got these guys on board instead.
We're all we've both taken up chain smoking Marlboros and Wests and Hoffmans and everything else just to keep the act going,
Yeah. State Express 555.
We should do that. Each season should be
review a cigarette.
Fields. I want the West versus East German cigarettes that we get on the 037s back in the European Championship back in the day.
That would be very meta even for us,
and also would be a commitment to the cause, because we'd both pop our clogs.
Very detrimental to our health.
Early.
Yeah. And speaking of tobacco sponsorship, it might be, this episode will feature, if you look at the videos, plenty of it, I'm sure. So this week, seeing as it's Monte, and this episode is going out on the day that Monte launches, we've decided to pick the favorite Monte Carlo from our lifetime. So we've both got a different rally picked, and why we like it, why we would have liked to have been there and spectated, and what made these choices so special to us.
Yes, and I think this is a really interesting way of framing it, and Killian should take credit for coming up with the idea, even if it does mean that, sadly, I have a few extra Monte Carlo rallies I can theoretically call upon.
That just gives you a wider choice. It means I'm quite limited. Comparison.
Can I have less choice, please? I'd like 25 years of choice, maybe. But yes, it's a fascinating way, and it's a theme that we're going to endeavour to continue at selected choice WRC rounds throughout the remainder of the year. The likes of Portugal and other Sweden and other sort of gala WRC events with
Rally Croatia.
Exactly.
A staple of the calendar for so many years. Which Rally Croatia would you choose?
I mean, guarantee if to split hairs, I could probably go back to something run under a communist dictatorship in the mid-80s, some 2-bit thing with, episode polonaises.
You're not that old.
Hey man, 88. I could just about sneak in with some episode polonaise action.
Right. So anyway, I suppose we better do this in chronological order, naturally, because you were a bit of a relic. You're a bit further back than myself. So what have you chosen?
I have chosen the 1991 running of the Monte Carlo Rally. I was 3 years old at the time, and I'd be lying if I said I was aware what rallying was. Although I probably did have access to a few Matchbox rally cars in RS 2000s, but not wittingly. And I've chosen it because it features, I think, one of the most interesting and fairly heartbreaking moments of pure human drama that Group A ever served up. And of course, I'm talking about Francois Delacour's fantastic storming run to basically winning first time out for Ford with the Sapphire Cosworth 4x4, and ultimately through no real fault of his coming up short in the final few kilometers. It kind of taps into one of the things that has always drives my interest in rallying in particular and motorsport in general, and that's the human side of things. As much as I like cars, tech, and oily bits, it's the characters and the human drama that sort of has always anchored me, and rallying lives in spades. So yeah, without further ado, 1991, very interesting season, if you ask me. Although Lancia's grip on the silverware had been broken by Carlos Sainz previously, it was still the dominant force. The Celica SD165 was a proven winner, but most people, I think, if you'd asked them, probably would have said that Lancia were the shoe in, and of course, without wanting to ruin the surprise, not that any of you should need to know this, it would ultimately go a Lancia man's way at the end, final reckoning with Kankkunen winning. But at the start of the year, it was very much up for grabs still. Group A had kind of come into its own, and I would suggest this is the start of when a lot of the cars that were purpose conceived to be Group A rally cars were committed to the sport and homologated as such, as opposed to earlier on in the decade, in the late 80s, when you had a lot of cars that were either not especially suited to rallying but thrust in anyway, like the three-door Cosy, or just happened to be quite well suited to the sport and had four-wheel drive and a turbocharged engine.
What would you say the state of the sport was at this point? Just thinking about it. I mean, early Group A, it produced some exciting cars, but I think it was still in that time, and exciting kind of drives because of the nature of the cars, E30s, things like that. But it was still struggling to kind of regain its footing with the masses after the demise of Group B. And like this, you'd nearly still call this early Group A because it's kind of early what Group A should have been, as it were, the purpose-built cars, as you say. It's probably still like 91, maybe not for everyone, and maybe not for everyone listening to this. There are like 90, 91, 92 are still kind of largely kind of a forgotten kind of gray area. Not quite forgotten, but you know what I mean. It was before the cars that Group A would ultimately be best known for had arrived, barring the Lancia. But the outside of a more deeper niche kind of bunch of rally fans, like the Sapphire Cosworth, of which you love, I know, wouldn't be the remembered Cosworth. The three-door and then the Escort would be the more memorable ones, potentially to a more mainstream kind of base.
Exactly that. I mean, I don't. I mean, that's, I guess, everything's subjective in that respect. I don't have an answer as to how good a health it was in, but I think you're completely right. I mean, no one except people who listen to this podcast, if you said which Celica GT4 comes to mind when someone says Group A Celica,
Not a 165.
165, is it? It's the
No.
185 or maybe the ST205.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, but I think 91, because of the emergence of Carlos Sainz the season before, and the fact that it proved that Lancia could be beaten, and we had the influx of Japanese teams, or at least Japanese teams still firmly committed. Obviously, we'll come on to this in a minute, but Mitsubishi had stepped up its commitment with a Gallant. Yeah, had Mazda with its 323, still underpowered and lacking cubic capacity, but still there. And the looming prospect of Nissan and co. So it's I think there's, whether you'd have been able to identify it at the time, I think it was probably a sea change and step forward. and I say this is the biggest Group A fan and apologist in the world, but even I would suggest that watching a very skinny Delta HF in 1987 competing in Sweden would have been a very hard thing to swallow if you'd been there 12 months previously. Things had finally kind of got up to speed a bit. The cars had a bit more visual drama, and as we know, because of the fairly so restrictor mandating, they were making a lot of power.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I think the arrival of Toyota proper with the 165 was really a commencement of the sea change. Like as you say, it did prove that Lancia could be dethroned, but kind of it was the sign of things to come with manufacturers from Japan coming in, and once the car got more reliable, certainly as well. And I think the 165 is probably gaining a bit more respect and following in the last 4 or 5 years or so than before as well.
I think that absolutely, and I think that the fact that there was a lot more competition, but I also think the fact that you had Oriole and Sainz to the fore, which now in a world, anyone listening to this will have grown up almost certainly in a world dominated by French and Mediterranean rally drivers doing very, very well across the board. But back then, this was to have a Spaniard and a Frenchman being, at the very sharp end of rallying and soon to start winning things in Finland and the places that conventional rallying wisdom held that no Mediterranean or anyone outside of Scandinavia should ever had any hope of winning. I think that is something that perhaps is slightly lost to history and time, because back then the WRC was far more of a closed shop in terms of who could win.
Well, yeah, the old adage of if you want to win, get a fin was still very much alive, and the likes of Sainz showed that you could take the fight to their home ground, as well, and then the rest of the 90s kind of bore that fruit. Tommy Mäkinen notwithstanding, maybe, but certainly his number of world championships aside, there was plenty of people right up there with him at the times that he won as well. He never quite romped away with them that drastically,
Exactly. And then into the mix you have Delacour, who, I mean, maybe not a left field option per se, because if you'd been interested in rallying, you'd have been well aware of the heroics he did with Peugeot 309s for Peugeot France the previous year, but certainly had never had a works drive before. He only got the nod when Ford at France sort of put pressure on Borum to take a chance on him, and even then he was still reckoned to be fairly subservient to Alex Fiorio and Malcolm Wilson, his teammates. And the Sapphire, obviously, as you said, one of my favorite rally cars. Absolutely adore it, especially in turbofan form. Beige turbofans. Who'd have thought? Beige turbofans. What a look. But still, yes, it was four-wheel drive. Yes, it had the 2-liter YB with plenty of boost, plenty of power. But it's an archaic car still, overly large, not especially light. I would suggest perhaps another example of Ford and Borum having to scrabble around to find a stopgap rally car. Not as much as a three-door, because that was just thrown in basically as a rallyized race car, but still not quite the ultimate Group A car that they would then get in a few short years with the Escort Cosworth.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned stopgap and Borum and Ford, because that's going to appear later on as well.
WRC.
Yeah.
So yes, it's always appealed, and my own personal supporting and liking of Delacour goes right back. I like I was firmly in his camp when I was watching rallying in the late 90s into the early 90s when he was at Peugeot and et cetera, and Ford. And I guess there's part of me that subscribes unwittingly to liking an underdog. And maybe in this scenario we're about to describe, Delacour, well, he was an underdog because he wasn't unproven, but still, at the time, he was reckoned to be the next big thing and a shoe-in for the World Rally Championship. And of course, subsequent events rather dispelled that. And I think as a kid, I always kind of latched onto that. So yeah, big fan of Delacour, and I would love to have been able to watch the Monte Carlo in 1991 stage side for myself. Right, so that particular Monte was the classic affair of largely free of snow and ice, but not completely free. I believe Sisteron and a lot of the second leg running earlier in the day had a lot of snow at the top of the cols, some such. And of course, you had the classic stuff of black ice being present underneath the shady side of the mountain on the descent and under the trees. So yeah, basically a classic Monte with the emphasis on tire choice that always brings. And that favoured Toyota at the time because TTE had firmly got into bed with Rallye. They had been the first to debut tyre warmers the year before, which Lancia rather caught Lancia on the hop slightly. This year they had probably developed a special compound of snow tyre, which soon proved its worth. I think one of the things that struck me when I was rewatching footage of this Monte is how much of a hangover of the bad old days of the Group A80s was still in effect in terms of spectator crowd control. I know that this was always a Monte issue, even up until the modern era. But back then, we are talking. I mean, it's near as makes no difference. Portugal, 1985, 1986, in terms of the people jumping out in front of cars, and this Monte was another. It was also a classic in terms of because you had the spectators were more than willing to shovel extra snow into the path of oncoming cars that they didn't like the drivers of particularly, which I don't know. I've always sort of blown hot and cold on because as a kid I thought it was amazing. It sounded like the most fun you could have in the world, and why wouldn't you want to stealthily shovel a bit of snow into your least fancied driver? But
it sounds so fucking nuts. Like, I mean, especially when you say these kind of packed crowds, like there's the potential of someone like spearing off into a crowd because he's hit this unsuspected patch of snow or something.
And there's a lot
really
of that.
playing with fire.
Yeah, not especially good brakes, snow, high speed, and sometimes less than stellar ice and gravel notes or ice and snow notes. Didn't help that Lube was feeling absolutely rubbish. So when he went slightly wide and straight on into a barrier, I think looking at the footage, it's the kind of thing now that would bring a stage to a halt. But back then it was just so right that the Armco's a bit dented and some spectators are slightly worse for wear. But we'll carry on. Speaking of which, chief among Ford's rivals were still Lancia. They had works or semi-works Delta Integrale 16 valves for Oriol, Biasion, Sabi, Kankkunen, and Lube. Oriol was the winner the previous year, which is what kind of announced himself as a Lancia man, but then proceeded to spend quite a lot of the remainder of 1990 demolishing Deltas, and the others were obviously very established heavy hitters. Biasion, minted double world champion at this point. Sabi, who apparently in the lead up to this had really damaged his back, so much so that the pain of it was making him feel physically sick. And earlier on, that was reflected in his less than stellar stage times and a few spins and stuff, which, as a man who struggled with back pain and would be shite in a Lancia Delta rally car, I can empathise with.
Yeah, you can imagine like Lancia's team doctor, or probably non-existent team doctor, some sort of.
It's just Fiorio, in a lab coat.
Yeah, he dons a lab coat and a stethoscope, sparks up another unfiltered cigarette, and fires a load of under the counter drugs. Yeah, Pervitin. Yeah. Especially with these crowds, when you think it adds up, it's a really dangerous formula. The man who was being physically sick into the unknown with these, badly managed crowds.
Yeah, with running big boost rally cars on slippery, low grip conditions, and and the stages having changed quite dramatically since the ice note guys went through. Isn't there thinking about?
And how many of these deltas were Jolly Club cars then, or what was the breakdown in the semi-works cars?
That would be Oriole had the chief Jolly Club car along with Sabi. And reading between the lines, I think Oriole was given a Jolly Club thing almost as a theoretical demotion, or perhaps as a punishment for having knocked the corners off so many cars the previous year. Although, as we both know, being in the Jolly Club Delta Integrale was hardly a step down at the time. You know,
Bit of a sideways move.
Sideways move.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't matter anyway, because he was quick at the start, but then suffered engine trouble, and then it grenaded itself, I think, on stage 8, rightly. Then we get Toyota. Of course, the ST165 for this point, a proven winner, with the aforementioned tyres well suited to its to this particular rally. Kankkunen had kind of done the lion's share of the pain earlier on the late 80s to wrestling with the car's evil reliability in 1989. Then obviously redecamped off to Lancia, which left Carlos Sainz as de facto team leader. I think it's easy to forget how little was known about him and his ability to fill that role before 1990. You know, now, because we know about Carlos Sainz, what he can do and how God-given he was, it's kind of course, he'd be the natural team leader for Toyota. But back then, as an unproven young Spaniard from a country without a particularly rich rallying heritage, I think it would have been a far less assured thing to assume. But there we are, you know, at 1991, you know, a world champion in a proven World Rally Championship winning car, with, of course, the X-Track transmission, still more trick than anything Lancia could hold one at the time. Ably supported by our friend of the podcast, Armin Schwartz, and Mark Dewey. So, you know, really, we should be supporting retrospectively TTE.
Yeah. But if to complete that trio, get Carlos on.
That would be a hard sell, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. And of course, Sainz would, of course, go on to fight tooth and nail throughout the 1991 season with Kankkunen, which has always fascinated me, in as much as because the two seem to chase each other around in terms of works berths for most of the period in the early 90s. You know,
it's really weird, isn't it?
Swapping from one to the other. You know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it worked out. I mean, I guess it worked out poorly when Kankkunen left TTE just in time for the Celica to come good in 1990. But then he kind of got his revenge, if you want to sort of phrase it like that, later this year by winning in the elderly Delta in 1991. Schwartz was this would actually be the best season, or the most competitive season in terms of points finishes for Schwartz's WRC career, because this is the season when he won outright in Catalonia later in the year, which is so weird when you think about it. I mean, I know we've talked about this on previous episodes, the idea that, you know, a Spanish round effectively being added to the calendar off the back of Sainz's success, in the same way that Zandvoort has been added off the back of Verstappen's success in F1. And here we have the German guy inheriting the win anyway. I mean, I find that fascinating. And then, of course, the also rans, as they would end up being, the likes of Mitsubishi and Mazda. Mitsubishi had big, heavy gallants, even though they were the lightest gallants still, but heavy nonetheless by the standards of the opposition. For Salonen and Kenneth Eriksson, and a trio of Mazda 323s for Hannu Mikkola, Jesus Puros, and Gregor de Mervius. They'd all retire for various mechanical maladies, except for Salonen, who would end up coming up with fairly distant 8th overall. And I believe, from what I understand, Salonen was. I mean, it's interesting. I always found Salonen's post-Group B career really interesting, because quite a heavy fall from being a world champion, the most successful driver in pure wins of the Group B era, in terms of Group B supercars, to kind of struggling in Mazda 323s and Gallants. It must have been a hard thing to swallow, I suspect.
I'd wager so. Yeah, it's just kind of like it just deserves like a big sigh, really. It's like come 86. Ah, that's all there is. Like it'd be easy to forget Salonen existed after 86,
Yeah, and
frankly, you know.
through no fault of his own either.
No, I mean, look, that Gallant wasn't up to much. It was fine. You know, it wasn't an inherently bad car, but it also wasn't an inherently competitive car.
No, I
You
mean it
know,
got plenty powerful later on.
yeah.
Which kind of accounted to as a counterweight for it being on the Lardy side.
Mm.
Uh, but I think no, it's not for nothing that its only win was the '89 RAC with Penty.
When you think of like the other kind of Group B graduates like Cankers, who went off and had a really good 90s, really, you know, and you think, well, surely Salonen deserves some of the same trajectory, but you know, I guess there's only so many opportunities, but
Yeah,
it's
but also
unusual.
Cankers would have been, a fresh-faced young gun who any team manager worth his salt would have thought we can market the hell out of this fella. Even back then, a sort of more naive time for Provo, I imagine. Whereas
Mm.
Saladin, a guy who had his roots in the mid-70s, driving Group 4 Nissans, come 1991. I mean, there's probably only about 8, 9, 10 years in it, but it must have
Mm.
felt easier to sort of sell him as a past master or something.
I guess.
So leg one basically seemed to confirm preconceptions that would be more of the standard running. Sainz scampered into the lead and would hold it for a good portion of the rally, leaving Biazon and Sabi to squabble over second and third. The latter still struggling with his bad back and a few spins, understandably caused by it. Kankin and Sabi both hit trouble even on the second stage. Sabi because of spinning. I think Kankin went wide off into the snowdrifts. At this point, Delacour was in a not distant fourth, but certainly a fairly subdued fourth. He he ended up blowing all four dampers early on in the first leg, going over a particularly high jump on the Col de Corobin. And you can see this footage and flipping heck. I mean, if there's ever an argument for how far damper technology has come in rally cars, this thing leaps high into the air and you can almost see all four dampers pop and give up the ghost when he lands. I mean, it's incredible. Supposedly Ford had to be convinced that over the radio that they were in fact Duff because they couldn't quite believe it. And it was only when he got back to service that they actually sort of realized how good a job he'd done on all four corners.
Not a rally known for its big jumps either, so you can understand that maybe
No,
you
and in
wouldn't
the
be quite
footage,
expecting such a thing.
well, exactly. And in the footage, you see Delacour go over, and then I think soon after it is Wilson. And no disrespect to Malcolm Wilson, but compared to the two, I mean, Malcolm Wilson could have been going for a drive on a Sunday through a high street, compared to the, I don't know, 2.5 feet of air that Delacour gets between Sumpgard and Alpine Road. It's quite impressive. He was just 2 seconds off winning the fifth stage outright, was Delacour. And then when quizzed about it later soon after, he said that he could have been quicker, but he missed a couple of gears midway through the stage. About this point, the Orioles Monte started to go awry. His engine and his Delta cut out for some reason halfway through. SS4 refused to start for a good few minutes, which basically spelled the end of his charge. He was quick when he got it running again. He won a couple of stages, but he was well down the order. And then later, I think it was SS8, the engine grenaded itself and chucked loads of oil over the front, and he went off the road because of that. Tricky conditions at this point. The usual classic thing of lots of black ice hidden under creeping trees, and the aforementioned spectators shoveling stuff on. Uh, but it basically ended with Delacour still snapping at the heels of the lead Toyota and Lanciers at the end of leg one. The second leg brought the closest set of stages that year's Monte had to full snow. There was a fairly heavy coating over the top of the cols, and this is where Delacour really started making hay. Stages, of course, he knew very, very well. He'd done exceptional work here the year before in the 309 GTI. By the end of the first stage, he'd overhauled both Lanciers to take second place overall behind Sainz. Still a fair way off, but certainly he started making headway, and he'd end up consolidating second over the remainder of the running that day. He'd end the second leg 9 seconds adrift of Sainz, but 2 minutes ahead of Biasion, Sabi, and Kankinen in that order.
Comfortable second then. And how far back was he from Sainz coming into the second leg?
Yes, he was just over a minute behind Sainz at the conclusion of the first leg, and then had jumped up to second, have made up effectively the best part of 55 seconds come the SS7, which is the pass through Burzet, which I believe is also Delacour now has a dog named Burzet. So maybe
well, there's a connection there. Well, look, a snowy mountain pass in Delacour. Anyone who's looked at Delacour's Instagram in the last couple of years knows what kind of training he puts in. So there was no Instagram in '91, but you can be sure that's the kind of antics he was up to in his off time, which enabled him to make up that 55 seconds or so.
Exactly that. And for the remainder of the leg, he'd basically chip away at Sainz's advantage. Certainly wouldn't all go his way, because Sainz still had the measure of him and some time in hand. It didn't help that Delacour's teammates Alex Fiorio and Malcolm Wilson suffered from various maladies. Fiorio's turbo started blowing, then blew completely. And then I think he had to have a new turbo fitted, which also started giving him jip. Wilson's charge was undone by front diff issues, and the re-emergence of an old leg injury from the previous year. The opening of the stages of the third leg saw Delacour finally do what he'd been threatening to do for the whole rally and relieve Sainz of the lead by a margin of 2 seconds to begin with. This would have been SS19, the Moulinet to La Boulogne Isobe stage, which is effectively one side of the Col de Turini. He didn't have it for very long, though, because Sainz struck back at the very next opportunity, the run up to Col de Killian, and he would emerge victorious with a handy buffer of 8 seconds over Delacour, which Delacour would then proceed to do what he normally did and chip away for much of the running of the final leg. That same pass, the one through the Col de la Coulelle, which is again over the top of the Col de Turini, the second pass would prove just as consequential, because this is where Delacour finally overhauled Sainz. Well, I was going to say good, but that might be a spoiler, but certainly it would have appeared to all watching that Delacour had finally done what he'd been threatening to and caught and overpassed Sainz for good. He emerged from that stage with a 10-second buffer and set about extending it. By this point, but come stage 24, 25 or so, Sainz had all but given up fighting Delacour, because he'd scampered off into such an impressive lead of the best part of 45 seconds or so that, even Sainz, when interviewed, said that he was happy to settle for second, bank the points.
Take the points. Think of the championship.
Exactly. Mr. Consistent, right? But it's the Monte, and it all came down to a final of the Col de Turini in the dead of night, and well, yeah, the usual Monte spanner of the work stuff happened. Delacour's hopes of a maiden win came unstuck. The first inkling that something had gone awry took the form of a flow of reports, most stating that a puncher had sent Delacour and the lead Sapphire off the road and out of contention. The truth took a little longer to filter through, but was no less devastating. It turned out that a rose joint at the left-hand rear of the Sierra had sheared, which caused Delacour to believe the wheel on that corner of the Sierra had come loose. Being a Frenchman surrounded by partisan spectators, he was able to pull over straight away and sort of converse with spectators to see whether the rear wheel was still attached, which they confirmed was. So he carried on at speed, and it was then a few kilometers later that the diff finally, or the diff mounting finally gave up the ghost, and the evil, ill, crabby handling threw him off into a snowbank off the road, and he lost 6 minutes and dropped third. And I mean, that's heartbreaking to recount, but really, me recounting it does nothing to convey how distraught it was. I mean, the footage is there online, and even, I mean, the Duke preview footage that you can get on YouTube seems to omit some of the really emotional bits, because from there they've obviously cut the bit where Delacour is learning of what's happened and how far he's fallen, how close he came. So it's just him being fairly composed and saying, towing the party line, you know, I'm here for Ford. It's still third on my debut, and it's good, yada yada yada. Whereas on fairly in-depth Googling revealed me finding the full Duke video in unedited form, and it's pretty heartbreaking. It's full of partisan pressmen and spectators and Delacour getting out the Sierra and smashing the roof in frustration, and it's completely understandable. I mean, it would have been one of the upsets of the Group A age, and I mean, maybe it's lent further tragedy might be too strong a word, but lent further symbolism and pathos by the fact that Delacour's career, as we all know, didn't turn out quite as we would have hoped, he would have hoped, or perhaps his talent deserved.
And nobody seems to love Monte as much as Delacour.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, Christ, Col de Turini, final night, the best part of a minute margin in the bag, and his chief rival all but actually admitted that he wasn't contesting anymore and it was out of his reach. And I mean, and it's not even a crash. I don't know whether it'd be worse or easier or better for him to stomach, whether it had been a big incident where he'd just gone too hot into a corner and stuffed it in a big way. But to have your rear suspension give out on you, and then not even that put you out directly, have the wayward evil handling caused by your iffy rear suspension being the thing that caused you to go off the stage, and in typical Monte fashion, not actually do any damage to the car, really.
Yeah. Just cost you a heap of fucking time.
And I don't want it to sound like I sort of go and pick my choice rallies based on negative drama, although perhaps if we have a discussion about this in 12 months' time and I've picked a succession of Delacour rallies where he has terrible events, then maybe we can reconsider.
This the rain shower on Tour de Corse.
Yeah, and the Australian big crash. Maybe that's a bit too negative. But anyway, I find it so compelling human drama, and of course I'd have been a lot happier recounting this if he'd won and it was a happy clappy story of this debut.
You would have picked it if he'd won, let's face it.
Well, I would have picked it because I like Delacour and I love a Sierra Sapphire, and this is the closest the Sierra Sapphire came to an outright WRC win, which that's pretty galling. And I would suggest perhaps lends credence to my thing about it being a stopgap. You know, this was it debuted halfway through 1990. I think Malcolm Wilson had done some pretty impressive stage times with it in San Remo, but you know, to have a new car's best result be the opening round of 1991 and then sort of kick around for the best part of 18 months before the Escort came on stream, and still to be a third place is maybe I should start, like, you know, idolizing successful rally cars. But
Well, you say like a new car, but I suppose ultimately that was the problem with the Sierra Sapphire. It wasn't really that new, was it? I mean,
four-wheel drive, but still reheated leftovers.
if you line it up next to its main competitors in that event, next to the Lancia and the
The
Celica,
Liga in particular.
and then this three-box barge, and a very cool one, but and as we know, looks alone don't determine a successful rally car, but maybe it wasn't the platform that was gonna got it.
The podcast medium doesn't suffice for the look that Killian gave me, and I must have shot him for him to add, and a very cool one.
I know. Look, I love a SAF as well, and and side exit exhausts always.
And beige turbo fans.
Beige over light navy livery, like it shouldn't work.
It's a disgusting livery.
It's horrifically amazing.
I love it. Yeah. Beige and blue and some like Q80 red and whatever. Yeah, it
red, white, and yellow, and then big flame out the side. And you've got all that boot, and it's such a flat. Yeah.
And Delacour with a full set of hair and a very attractive co-driver who's his actual girlfriend. I mean, it kind of writes itself. Heck, maybe there's a reason it couldn't go as a fairy tale, because it'd be too neat if it had.
Didn't she respond to you on the gravel crew one time or reach out?
She did, yeah. I posted a few pictures of I think it was from this rally, and maybe a bit later from the Tour de Corse, and yeah, just explained how much he enjoyed it and everything else, really. But I thought better of. My French isn't good enough to be able to woo a sophisticated 40-something and the rest rally lady. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
The less said about that, the better.
So yeah, that's my choice. I want to stress again that I didn't pick it for the negative side, but I do find the human drama so interesting. My long-term support of Francois Delacour remains undiminished, and I find this the most compelling. So I genuinely think there's a lot. I don't know if he was the most mentally. I don't think mental fortitude was one of Delacour's strongest attributes. And perhaps, and maybe I'm just diagnosing from afar here, which one should never do, let alone someone with no actual psychological experience. But I do think that his career would have been a lot more fruitful if perhaps he'd started off with a win in an unfancied Ford Sierra, and perhaps further doors would have opened. And of course, turned down that offer of test driving the F40 3 years later.
And there's a parallel time stream where the Sapphire's rear suspension didn't give way and F40s didn't exist or something.
This is the world that I inhabit, yeah.
Well, if it was up to you, the Sapphire would have been competing till 99 or something. So, yeah. But no, I know. I mean, it's not, you're not choosing it because of, the failure of one man. I mean, it is an interesting story. It's rife with drama, and just because it was all teed up and then didn't happen doesn't mean the story is any less exciting for a car that it proved it could have won. Just because it didn't.
It's also classic Monte, isn't it? I mean, Sainz was dead set on track to win the year before until I think it's Celica cried no more and Oriol inherited the lead. I mean, if there's any rally, I mean, it's obviously part and parcel of the fabric of rallying full stop, but the Monte is kind of the preeminent force in serving up despair.
Yeah, especially because it's always like, new car, new year. So there tends to be these odd issues, and there's, we've had years where cars haven't left Parc Ferme,
The other greatest rally car of the modern era as well, the Octavia WRC. Famous. Yeah. So how about you, Killian? What's your selection?
Well, Jamie, my pick is the 1997 running of the event, the dawn of a new era in top flight rallying, and one that I, as a youngster, would be obsessed with, and still has the top spot in my heart. 97 was the year that ushered in the new World Rally Car regulations that you could argue still kind of hold true today, doing away with this homologation numbers, bringing increased performance as well, and hoping to attract more manufacturers to the sport. However, interestingly enough, only 4 World Rally cars would start this event, which even when going back to write this kind of boggled my mind a little bit, given how many would start the event literally the next year and the year after that. 2 years later, 19 world cars would start the same event between works and private teams, admittedly, but world cars nonetheless.
That's an incredible stat. Absolutely. I mean, it speaks volumes to about the amount of money still swilling around at the time that it would take just a handful of years for the number of, homologated, developed and sold WRC cars to explode.
Yeah. So now onto the contenders. We had, I suppose, right at the top of the list, I guess probably what would have been the expected favorites going in? Mitsubishi, or Rallye Art Mitsubishi, I guess. 1996 world champion Tommy Mäkinen, freshly minted, returning in a Group A Lancer Evolution 4, as Rallye Art has opted to stick with the Group A cars for the time being. A move that, while seeming like it would spell disaster right from the off, would really only bite them a few years later, to be honest. Uwe Nettel would drive the second Lancer on the event, this one being a proper Group A car in that it was a Evo 3 and a better looking car, actually.
Peak Evo.
I much prefer the Evo 3. I think the 4 is too much of a bit of 3 and a bit of what came after, that the rear end on the 3 is much nicer for my liking.
Yes, everyone's overlooked Evo as the 4, isn't it? Sadly.
Yeah. Nice car all the same. No, well, I said it is a Group A car, and it very firmly is one. It isn't like they just slapped a new badge on the car, changed the rear end, and went home early as the other teams were developing cars to the World Rally regs. No, this car would feature an all-new sequential box, something both of its competitors here lacked, in fact, as well as relocating and rotating the engine, the infamous or famous 4G63 180 degrees for better balance.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite something, isn't it? I mean, there's homologation changes and and completely. I've always found that interesting because it speaks volumes to how highly Mitsubishi regarded rallying at the time, that they'd be willing to countenance doing such a huge invasive change.
And even the fact that the World Rally regs had come in and sequentials would have been allowed. The only Group A car here was the one that ended up with a sequential as well. But you'd think that almost immediately you'd go, well, there's an engineer at Pro Driving Board rubbing their hands going, all right, finally, sequential boxes, let's go, and that was an Invex sequential box, if memory serves.
They certainly weren't resting on their laurels, were they? It's easy to count it as just clinging on to Group A for too long, but not a bit of it.
Far from it, really. I mean, as I say, it did bite them later, but that's a story for another day. But they were kind of borne out for a couple of years, to be fair, given that on paper it really shouldn't have worked.
Absolutely.
So then we have Ford. Now, Ford would debut the new Escort WRC for this season, aegisly distinguished from its Group A forebears by its different rear wing, as the distinctive one from the older car was too big under the new regs and needed to be reduced. The max width currently allowed in the World Rally regulations was 1,365 millimeters, and an all-new, all-awesome noise. I think the Escort WRC has to be right up there for best sounding of the World Rally car era, along with S12B also cracking. But I think Escort WRC, particularly for its anti-lag.
Yeah, it's not objectively, it's not a nice noise. It's just a racket, and an amazing racket. It's like a load of spanners being in a bag chucked down some metal stairs, and I love it.
And unlike the Mitsubishi, it retained a H-pattern box, though this wouldn't stay there for long, and it would get a sequential later in the year. 97 was Ford's first year partnering with Malcolm Wilson's M Sport outfit. This very much a transition period for Ford. It's kind of unusual. Borum undertook the design and development of the new car, but M Sport would build and run the cars. To be honest, Escort WRC is an episode of its own. I actually trimmed out a load of Escort WRC things here because I could easily get bogged down into it, and it's It's a really interesting car and topic in itself. And I bet Jamie's itching to point out now that about Ford calling the FIA's bluff on homologation, aren't you?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, I've always found it interesting that the way that Ford and the FIA come sort of a backroom deal to effectively allow them to compete in another halfway house Ford rally car.
Exactly, yeah. It's and we've purely ended up at both these topics by accident, and there's a line between them here. Yeah, so technically it's an extension of the Group A homologation, and I won't list off some numbers now, but yeah, it's a modification of the RS Cosworth homologation technically. Um,
And you can
former
see
world,
why the FIA, you can see why the FIA did blink in that respect. It's a case of what do you want two WRC cars at the starting lineup or
well,
four?
this is it. Yeah, I mean, they would have it would have been the FIA left with egg on their face if only Subaru had turned up with a World Rally car to these new exciting formula.
I was lucky enough in a previous life, lucky enough to interview Michael Wilson over the phone in the lead up to 2017 about their new WRC cars, and I asked him about this. I always found it interesting about how it kind of broke down in terms of who did what and how the deal was struck. And Malcolm said it was all Ford forum, but mainly Ford at Detroit sort of throwing its weight around. Um, you know, M Sport got on with the nitty gritty of making rally cars, whereas it sort of was passed up the chain for heavy hitters to throw their weight around, which makes sense, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, ultimately, it's the big manufacturers that the FIA would be afraid of, I guess. So, just like this goes right back to your one now as well. Former world champion Carlos Sainz would return to lead the team's challenge, ably abetted by Armin Schwartz, uh, friend of the pod, as you say. Now partnered by Denis Giraudet, who'd been sitting with Armin since Toyota's enforced sabbatical in 1995. Um, Schwartz had partaken in the development of the car with engineer and friend of his, Philip Donovan, who was now no doubt itching to get going. And this was all Borum development and testing, I suppose we should point out. Um, Donovan actually leave the project quite early. Again, that's a story for another day, really, I guess. And then we have Subaru. Subaru had and ProDrive had embraced the new regs with the Peter Stevens designed two-door Impreza, or as ProDrive would call it, the S5 WRC. Possibly one of the best looking rally cars of all time.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's indisputable, really. Yeah, yeah. There's a reason that everyone of our generation and surrounding it just fell in love with rallying, and I dare say that car was well over 50% of the reason why. Because how could you not just look at it?
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I mean, if given the choice, I would actually, if you said, okay, take your pick between an S5 or a 555, I would take a 555, but there's just the S5 just looks so at home on a stage, and the big arches look so well with that two-door shape. And I think Stephen just did a great job, and the car looked really, really smart.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, if you strip away our collective love for the underdog, the S5 WRC is the clear winner. It's such a good thing. Pete Stevens also the guy who penned the McLaren F1 in terms of
mhm.
styling as well.
Yeah,
Were
decent
good eyes,
CV.
not bad, eh?
Yeah.
And it's 22.
So swollen arches, a more sporting appearance now with the two-door body shell. It would have been starting from a stiffer, a better torsional rigidity standpoint as well with the two-door, you'd imagine. And like its rival from Ford, was also still using a H pattern box and was yet to acquire the active differentials later Impreza WRCs would be equipped with. Now, this two-door Impreza, despite looking kind of quite advanced, it actually shared quite a lot with its Group A predecessor. The engine was just a revised version of the Group A power plant. No, it had numerous revisions. Most notably, I guess the turbo was relocated, enabling a much bigger air intake and an improved exhaust system as well. The Banbury outfit was fielding two cars for this event. T2 WRC would be crewed by 95 champion and 96 runner-up Colin McRae with Nicky Grist alongside him. And this was Nicky's first season with Colin. And then Piero Liatti, who was to do the tarmac events for this season, while Kerrit Eriksson would contest the gravel events. So Piero was piloting P3 WRC, co-driven by Fabrizia Pons who'd been, very successful in her co-driving career to this point. She'd taken an extended break at one point, actually. I think she did a rally between 86 and 94 or something crazy like that, like a big gap post Group E. Pons had a big gap.
Just sitting out all those narrow deltas, it's like stuff that now Michelle's gone. I'll kick her around for a wee bit and come back when things are getting good again.
I mean, a few strong names running in Group A machinery. A name again from your pick, Didier Auriol in was it in RAS Sport prepared Escort RS Cosworth?
Yeah.
Well, it was an Escort Cosworth, but it is RAS Sport and that Mobile One colours.
Red, white, and blue Mobile One colours. Yeah.
Yeah. And strong up and comer, Freddie Likes. And Sven Smits in their ST205 Celica GT4. Quite a few Celica ST205s in this event as well. Lundegard was knocking about in one as well.
Did the guy who knocked out Rocky? It's easy to forget how hot a property Freddie Likes was back in this period, fresh off the back of giant killing in Belgium with the same car.
And he was barely out of the Astra days at this point. As well, isn't that what he really cut his teeth in? It was an Astra GSI.
He had to spell in that Caliber as well, didn't he, for his sins?
Yeah, that's unfortunate, isn't it? So for the first time since the 1960s, the rally would feature a special stage to kick off proceedings in the Principality itself, which was also going to be repeated for the final stage, rather unusually. As usual with Monte, weather conditions would have a big impact on the event, with crews expecting to see snow, ice, and wet tarmac as the elevations changed on the stages in the mountains. So why is the 97 running with a seeming lack of top-level cars my choice for favour? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it ushered in the era of WRC that I most closely associate with it. So it's always going to have a prominent place in my heart. As just a couple of years later, young me would be glued to the Eurosport coverage, fascinated by the cars this new rule set had created. And, my old man had a Focus in the drive. It was a 5-door, but it did look reasonably similar to the one I was watching on the TV.
Was it in that teal green colour?
It actually was. Yeah. Yeah, it was. And it was actually, I suppose maybe appropriately for this episode, it was written off on ice about 400 yards from our house. My dad was taking it to work one day, clouted a bollard outside of school as he tried to brake before the pedestrian crossing and slid straight into the bollard just around the corner. Yeah. And he actually couldn't have been going more than 20 kilometers an hour because he only would have turned out of our estate as well. And it was that green, yeah. So they wrote it off. Or maybe he hit something else in that. He crashed a lot of things, my dad. No, he didn't. No, that wasn't near the school. That was somewhere else in the Focus. It must have been something else done. He crashes lots of things.
Does he listen to the podcast?
No.
And is he going to be happy with you, trashing?
Oh, I've been giving him abuse for crashing things for years. We could spill the rest of this episode of me listing the things he's crashed. So, where was I? Yeah, so I know it's a romantic notion, but formative rallying memories owe a lot to the World Rally Car rules. And looking back, it's interesting as well. Like current me is probably more fascinated by Group A, maybe just because that was the one that preceded my interest. And like 97 has kind of one foot in Group A and one foot in the future. And with the two competing World Rally cars, the Escort and Impreza, still having close ties to their predecessors, which makes them more interesting from both a technical perspective as well. Speaking of those two, I never tire of watching them being flung around. You know, I adore the Escort, and I've been a diehard Subaru fan, all my car loving life or whatever, and I've owned plenty, or multiple ones rather. Um, but I love the Escort. We've mentioned the ALS sounds. And I have a far greater attraction to the Escort WRC than its Group A 4Runner. The Escort RS cars were really never excited me a whole pile. Like I appreciate it, it's cool. 7 gears is too many. Um, it never lit a fire in me the way Sierras and of both types, both the three door and the Sapphire and then Escort WRCs did. Just didn't really. I never found it that exciting, to be honest.
I think you've hit on something good there in terms of it being a foot 97 being a foot in both camps, and it's reflected in the cars and how they drive as well. This is still
Mm,
an era when guys raised in Group B or Group A driving and the sort of fairly analog manhandling approach that required could still do well and drive WRC development. And you see it, there's none of this handling on rails like you get 8 years later. It's
mm.
still quite sort of heavy-handed, throw it around and deal with the consequences, and
They're,
oversteer out your situation.
they're keeping the car moving around still a lot more at this point, rather than taking that smoother approach. A lot more of using the weight transfer, shifting the car's weight about before the corner, rather than picking a line and sticking to it,
And having to
letting the
work
active
to
diffs
get that as
sort it
well.
out. Say again.
Yeah. And having to physically work to get the car to do that as well, in terms of, the physical input.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at the amount of adjustments to the steering wheel that these guys are doing in this time, and even up to kind of 99, 2000, maybe 2001. There's still so
Yeah,
much
yeah.
of this flinging and crossing of arms going on inside the car as you look over, in my opinion, the much better onboard angle. The onboard angles we have today are fairly poor, I think, but again, that could develop into a rant quite quickly.
Onboard angles have been shite since we lost Subaru and the inlet on the bonnet. That's the hill I'm dying on.
Okay. Okay. We can pop that in the WRC TV suggestion box or something. Do you think when they were designing this new tubular space frame safety cell, they would have had a good angle for the onboard mount built in?
I just want a boxer inlet scoop on anything. That's it.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, and as for the Impreza, there isn't many rally cars that look that good on the stage, as we said. And I love for all its advancement, it's still very analog nature, as you just pointed out. Though it did lose out in the sound department of the earlier cars. We did lose something post 96 with Subarus, although we did regain a great noise in the S12B, which is one of my favorite sounding rally cars ever, but it's not the Boxer noise either. It's nice for a different way. So on a pure sensory pleasure basis, plonk me in front of the telly with the Monte 97 clips, commentary or no, and you'll find me grinning ear to ear. That Repsol Escort livery is great as well. They look great on tarmac. Every car here looks good, really, bar the back of an Evo 4. Further enhanced by some tasty SC205s mixing it up as well. No, none of this is really enough justification. We've got to talk about what went on. So let's get to the meat of it, the fight on the stages. Crews entered a slippery, rainy SS1 on the Super Special, the shortened version of the GP circuit, which was ultimately won by Belgium's Fast Freddy Likes in his Celica, 2 seconds clear of Carlos Sainz. So it doesn't bode well initially for this new World Rally cars, does it? This Escort WRC whooped by a semi-private Celica ST205, which would have been a couple of years out of date at this point, really. Now, of course, super specials mean realistically nothing. So the real action will be in the mountains north. So stage two. Oh, fuck it. I don't know how much of a go I can have at pronouncing this.
I'm so glad
La
you struggled.
Louveste. Anyway, stage two. Uh, stage two won by the Spaniard. The stage started at an altitude of 500 meters and finished at just over 1,000 meters on slushy, icy roads. Um, Treacherous conditions in a high performance machine that's on the wrong tire. If you're Tommy Mäkinen, who was on the wrong tire and sliding all over the place. Now, if you look at the footage, obviously there isn't a massive amount of footage at this stage, but he looks like he's having an absolutely horrendous time. Clouts a signpost and banks. while Sainz looked much more composed. Although, oddly enough, if you look at the footage from that stage, you wouldn't believe that Sainz actually ended up only 4 seconds faster. If you look at what Mäkkinen's doing in that Evo, you'd expect him to be way further back. Although Sainz is pretty, he can be very conservative at times. You wouldn't expect him to be going flat out on the second stage of the rally. Sainz had actually chosen wets while Tommy opted for studded tires. It just didn't seem to work out for him. Colin McRae, on the other hand, who was coming into this event with a lot of hope in the new Subaru, was never a huge fan of Monte and would finish the stage 24 seconds slower than Carlos. Again, struggling the conditions. Car was penduluming all over the place. So by the end of the second leg of the rally on day 2, we would have actually had 4 different stage winners for the day, with Mäkinen claiming the fastest time on the second stage, while Liati would claim 2 fastest times, and Freddie Likes would again claim a stage win, beating the times of the new classic cars, despite a spin and hitting a bank earlier in the day, kind of clouting the front end of it, but no major damage. Armin Schwartz would also pick up some damage to his escort and finish the day nearly 3 minutes adrift of the leaders. With the day's proceedings wrapped up, it seemed clear who the fight for victory would be between, but at the top, Sainz and Mäkinen just 3 seconds apart, followed by Liati another 21 seconds back. McRae in 4th place was over 2 minutes behind and really completely out of contention. Liati seemed to be having a much better time of it in his Impreza, while Colin was frustrated with the position he found himself so early on.
Did you find yourself, because you it's interesting now that there's a whole generation of people who have grown up being Colin McRae fans without ever having watched him as a rally driver in his prime, as a career rally driver, which is fine. But what I find interesting is how, growing up watching Colin, and I'm sure you would agree, it was always a sort of like bugbear at the back of my mind that he was going to start each season with this event that he really famously detested, the Monte.
Openly, I mean, he'd never hit it.
Yeah, and as a Colin McRae fan, it's like, and the thing that struck me is like now, obviously with the passage of time, he's a legend. He won his championship. It's fine. It's fantastic. But at the time, when he was actually competing year after year, I remember I each year I'd have this sort of mental dread as a kid. It's like, oh man, this is going to be a painful start.
Yeah, it's really odd, especially because like the Monte roads, if you take the conditions away from it for a second, right? Like the Monte roads themselves are like he's quite decent or good to watch on similar roads, right? Okay, like you look at very your San Remos and things like that. You can compare a lot of the roads in San Remo, which is only literally down the road from Monte anyway. Is similar tarmac. Okay, remove the snow and ice element for a little bit. Well, like, he was never that bad in Sweden and the likes, and you think, if he just kind of kept it together and, if he didn't like the mix of conditions, that he keep it together and kind of hammer it around on these dry tarmac hairpins or whatever. And he just, and I don't know, was he kind of a victim of, he decided at some point he didn't like it. And it was just because he decided he didn't like it that it was never going to work, no matter what he did.
That's what I'd love to know more. And I suspect it's the kind of thing that, because sadly he's no longer with us, but even if he was, perhaps unless you were, I don't know, you knew him personally, he'd never tell you. I'd love to know whether it was a case of, a chicken and egg. Was it a sort of mental thing that he decided, I dislike this, but I mean, he wasn't short of mental fortitude, and I'm sure he would have come round to the idea that you can't start every WRC title season on this kind of back foot. But I mean, yeah, he never did make it work per se, did he?
It still seems hard to believe that he just always had these kind of, if not shockers, but nothing to write home about at Monte.
It's never an easy thing being a McRae fan in period, was it? It was never, you could never, like Tommy Mäkinen, sit back and sort of say, maybe he'll win this one, it's fine, I can go for the kettle on. Colin, there was always
particularly because, of course, when I started watching it, like, it was the Focus days. So although I knew the Subaru thing at the time, but when I was like 7 in 99, and I very much remember watching Kenyan Safari in 99, I can picture clearly the bit of footage I was watching. it was Colin the focus. And while the driving styles was very much flamboyant, and obviously he didn't have, he had mixed success, I suppose would be the way to put it.
Not helped with the fact that 99 Focus's reliability was just shocking.
No, I had that awful fucking rear spoiler as well. I hate that rear spoiler.
And the livery is shite compared to the others.
Shite.
Well, anyway, I digress. I apologize. Carry on, mate.
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll have to get a message to Nicky Grist or someone. Maybe he can offer some opinions on the Monte thing. Somebody must know. So yeah, the next day dawned with clearer skies and drier roads for the most part, free of snow, but damp and drying in places. Stage 7 kicked things off, a repeat of stage 4 from the previous day. Another 500-meter change in elevation, climbing on typical twisty roads one associates with this rally, opening with a rather technical section, becoming faster and more flowing, then getting more demanding and technical once again, before leading to an incredibly quick section about 6 kilometers from the end. Sainz would lose the lead to Mäkinen here, who would remain the leader throughout the day, while Pierre Liatti and Fabrizio Pans continued their form from the second half of the previous leg and would claim to win on the opening stage of the day, 13 seconds faster than Mäkinen, and now moving into second place. McRae's woes, to bring him back up again, culminated in an off on the same stage, hitting a tree and breaking the rear suspension, limping back to service with the rear left wheel flopping and crabbing about, and he would retire from the event. Fortunately for Subaru's hopes of good manufacturer's points, however, their choice of teammate for McRae was paying off in Liatti, who was staying in touch with the two world champions, and he was sharing the top 3 with and looking very at home in the new Impreza, trading places with Sainz twice. He got as close as 8 seconds to the lead at one point before ending the day 24 seconds off in third place, 3 seconds behind Sainz only. Stage 8 resulted in the 5th stage winner in Armin Schwartz, who despite competitive times in this leg was too far back after the previous day to challenge for a podium position. Freddie Likes, who was performing strongly till now, went off on the same stage as McRae, but was able to continue, and then after the following stage ended up back in 9th after another incident on stage 9 left him in 21st place after losing 22 minutes.
Celica looks great as well with its rear 3/4 held together with gaffer tape, but that's probably because of pervert and quite like WRC cars that have Group A cars that have been damaged.
I love a bit of running repairs.
Schwartz's Focus looked great as well with half its face missing earlier on as well.
Yeah. I don't know what it is about it, because you couldn't get it now because everything disintegrates when you pull one of the arches off. They seem to held together. Like this is the era where you'd smash them, but they'd remain in place, but they'd be all smashed up, and it's just kind of, you're wearing their scars kind of proudly to an extent. Back in the service park, however, Sainz was complaining of engine issues and misfires throughout the day. Now, whether this was a sort of racing driver's excuse or not, I don't know. Because he's still sitting in third, and he wasn't losing dramatic amounts of time to Liatti or Mäkinen, although Mäkinen was still holding on to the lead, but by no means looking like victory was assured. Now, looking at the footage, the stage times and results from this leg really shows why this rally is so appealing, I think. At this point in the event, after 12 stages, you have 5 different stage winners, which in itself is pretty fucking cool, considering it's 4 different cars built to 2 different rule sets. Although obviously the Evo 4 is not really like an old Group A car by any means. And it's all set up for this 3-way fight to go right down to the wire. The top 3 have basically remained within the same sort of gap the whole way through the event, and a chance for one of the 3 to claim their first WRC victory, ably guided by Pons, who is no stranger to the top step of the podium, of course.
Good old sister-in-law.
The final leg of the rally would start with the famous Sister-on stage. In this running, 37 kilometers of tricky, narrow, tree-lined tarmac, climbing for the first 25 kilometers before a descent to the finish for the last 11. And to put it into kind of some perspective as well, like obviously 37 kilometers is a bloody long stage. The last running of this stage was 20 kilometers,
Jesus.
you know. So yeah, that's a lot to be,
Yeah.
at a maximum, particularly into the last day, when you have a few crews, within X amount of seconds of each other. And this is a stage that this stage alone could be make or break for your entire rally.
What absolutely. What I find quite interesting is to go back to mine. Within such a tiny span of years, 91 to 97, you've already got a sea change in how rallies are run. Come 97, we have 3 legs run on a Friday to a Sunday. It's fairly tightly prescribed for how long they can be. Whereas 91, it starts on a Thursday, runs through to Monday night, and it's a complete, there's no real formula as to how long stages really need to be. You can have overnight running well into the night, but for better or worse. I mean, better because it was fantastic, but I find it fascinating how, within 6 years, things have become markedly more homogenized and would continue to be so. The next from 97 to 2000, things get even more sort of formulaic in that regard.
Yeah, because like what really struck me listening to your one is that the 91 running finished in the night.
Mm.
Whereas
Yeah.
coming from a
And proper
today's
night
point of
as
view,
well, not
yeah,
just like 6:30 at night.
yeah, it was at night. It wasn't just the evening and it had been dark, and coming from now, and it was actually still surprising to me because obviously watching Monte for the last 20 years or so or whatever. The thought of it finishing in darkness seems so strange and alien now.
Yeah, it's a shame. You can take these things too far, but yeah. Anyway,
So Liati, in an interview with TV crews in the service park, deemed the sister on stage terrible and very difficult. Um, no, whether that was some sort of gamesmanship, I don't know, but he announced he'd go full attack, and full attack he did. For a guy claiming the stage was terrible, Liati would go out and win the rain-drenched opener 9 seconds faster than Sainz. No, 9 seconds faster than anyone on any stage is bloody quick. But to be, 9 seconds actually as a gap over 37 kilometers on that stage is bloody close. It shows the level these guys were operating at. And crucially, 38 seconds quicker than Mackinnon, who had again found himself on the wrong tyre. Elevating Liati to first place, 12 seconds clear of Sainz, and Mackinnon with a further 2 back. So starting to get really dramatic here now. Determined to fight back, Tommy would comfortably win the following stage, 6 seconds quicker than the Subaru crew, and closing back in on the lead. But not for long, as a spin on special stage 15 would cost him too much time and put him out of the fight for the win completely, short of some sort of unforeseen events ahead of him.
it's one of those classic Monte spins as well, isn't it? Like a really low drama, low speed, end swapping. Yeah, where the crew has time to effectively put their hands up and think and really, really absorb how annoyed they are.
Yeah, the one you can feel even more so because they've got so much time to react in frustration, mid spin even because it's so slow. Though Mackinnon would remain in third. So this would effectively put any chance of the lead changing hands out the window, as despite El Matador's best efforts, Liati, with the taste of the winner's champagne on his tongue, put in a masterful performance, winning all remaining stages, giving the World Rally Car era an all-new winner in an all-new car, 55 seconds ahead of twice champion Carlos Sainz. Perhaps not the winner one would have expected going into this event with such stacked opposition, another reason why this event is, in my eyes, so special. This was truly a moment to be seized by the Italian, and I think by early on the second day, he knew the top step was within reach, especially with McRae gone. I think this, you know, he didn't have to worry about, trying to be McRae's backup. He was feeling good in the car. You know, he kept his head, and he shared the podium with 2 world champions standing above them both for the first time, while his world champion teammate could only watch from the crowd.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And not from the artist's point of view, if you were going to only have one top flight win to your name, not a bad one to choose. Monte and the opening chapter of a new perhaps the most consequential era in rallying history. It's no bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. I mean, coming into this era, you've got those heavyweights with them. Okay, McRae, not perhaps take out of contention, but he was never going to be a Monte favorite. But the other two, completely. So fair play to Liadi. That's not to discredit the man, by any means. But he's tackling some big guns on a very specialized, very challenging, very changing event. Like the stages evolve so quickly and so unexpectedly in Monte, and that's what holds so much. That's why it's so special.
Quite a lot for
Um,
it.
yeah, and he handled it with sublime class and just great win. I think he seemed to be a very popular winner within his competitors as well. It's fantastic, and that's 97 for me.
I think you've done a very good choice. I mean, I think we both discussed how big a role that particular running had in our respective formative rally loves, and it's not hard to see why. I think that rally, and certainly what it represents, the start of the WRC era, is the undersold most important sea change in top tier rallying history. It's that severing of that homologation Gordian knot, to borrow a McLean phrase, and it's everything. It's we might not like how it means we can't buy homologated versions of a Corolla WRC, but the fact that we have been able to watch top tier rallying in that kind of car for the last quarter century exists, in my view, because of the WRC regulations.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's no doubting that whatsoever. I mean, these regulations did prove their worth, and over the 98, 99 and onwards, although I guess particularly from 98 to 2003, I guess, in terms of number of manufacturers and whatnot.
Yeah, it was a sweet spot, wasn't it? I mean, I think the global economy was humming along at that point as well, and the FIA was listening to the manufacturers, and we were rewarded. I think that was a successful experiment in a new formula. We are going to press ahead with doing these, as we said, with choice events for the remainder of the 2023 WRC roster calendar. Well, let us know what you think. We're definitely going to polish our plan of attack, and hopefully you found it interesting. We'd love to hear what you guys would consider your own personal favorite Monte Carlo rallies, but you have to keep it in the time span of when you were alive and kicking. No point picking one from long before. So we'd both love to hear your input.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this kind of one a bit more fun. It narrows the window a bit, and you kind of put a bit more thought into the choice, perhaps.
And no Group B. Who the fuck would want Group B? Just overloaded toss. Yeah, no
load of shite.
Undramatic cars. And easy to drive,
easy to drive. Not a lot of glamour attached to it. Way too safe.
Short stages.
Yeah. You could pick and choose your events. Turn up at fuck all. You could be off lapping Estoril. Looking forward to kind of maintaining this format throughout the year with a few select events, and hopefully it won't be as rusty maybe as this one, and we might hone it a little bit. And and as this is going out on Monte start day, I suppose it'd be rude not to discuss this year's Monte, despite her lack of attention on current affairs.
Where's the Monte going this weekend coming? Is it?
Hmm.
Who's your suggestion for an outright winner?
It might be very lazy to suggest Ogier, but I mean, is it hard to look past him? Callis struggled last year at Monte. I know he won the power stage, but he wasn't the Callis we saw later in the year. And I think ultimately this kind of rally probably still doesn't suit him. And Ogier just has so much more experience on it. And he hasn't been out of the car as long. you know, I mean, obviously he was in the last event. I know we've had a break, but he's coming into it with the same break everyone else has had now, rather than someone that's been in and out of the car. The Yaris looks fantastic. It's sounding way better as well. There's definitely a new sound to it. It sounds tremendous. I
Very hard to not get excited about the weeks leading up to Monte with the Monte pre-event testing videos, isn't it?
they're the best pre-event testing videos as well, bar Finland maybe. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's my choice. I mean, Oit has never been a big Monty man either, and I think he's been, you know, particularly after that accident in 2020, he's been struggling even more. I don't know. So we'll see. And plus the Puma, okay, it did have a good Monty last year, but you know, as you said before, M Sport traditionally come out of the blocks rather strong, and they did seem to get left behind a little bit last year. So it's the prospect is not the same for the Puma. Happy to be proven wrong, but who knows? What
Yeah,
about you?
I think well, I would have gone to Rogier as well, but since you've taken that, I'm going to probably go for Cali because heck, everything you say is completely correct about it not being an environment as he's traditionally well suited to, but equally he's wunderkind and probably going to rewrite the record books as long as he chooses to stay around and not do something else. So I you know, I can't have Ogier, the old head on old shoulders. I think Cali is probably the other one.
Another year of Toyota domination, then. Is that what we're expecting?
I suspect so. Elfin's
Interesting to
going to have
see
to
what,
put his socks on.
yeah, I mean, he seems to have kind of been left a little bit, does he? Hopefully he's a better year this year. He seems like a good lad, so we'll
But
see.
then equally, you know, talk about two teammates, right? I mean, a once in a generation talent paired with the perhaps the last once in a generation talent. I mean, it's yeah. Short of coming of age in 2002 as a rally driver and have to deal with Seb 1, there aren't many tougher, sterner tests, I think.
No, no, absolutely not. So yeah, let's bring this episode to a close. This has been episode 1 of season 3. Um, Thanks to all of you who've come back to listen to us after our break and who've been sticking with us so far. Thanks very much again for Slip and Grip Automotive for coming on board. Please check those guys out, Facebook, Instagram, and go to their website to find out a bit more. If you're looking to book a test day, those guys can help you out. It's a great facility, and you get some valuable seat time on a very representative tarmac stage.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much to Ross and the guys at Slip and Grip. And thank you very much to everyone who's tuned in again to listen to us waffle on about Monte Carlos. Here's to a fantastic season. And please tune in again for series 2, episode 2.
Yeah. So follow us on whatever podcast platform you listen to us on. Please give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts if you can. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook and check out Jamie's Facebook page, The Gravel Crew, for some more rally content. Thanks very much for listening once again, and goodbye.